Welcome to the Linguava podcast, The Invisible Profession, where we give you tools, tips, and resources in medical interpretation and translation that help bring to life our industry and ultimately help improve health outcomes for the limited English proficient communities.
Hey, good morning, David. How's it going?
Hey, Daniel. Good morning. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. We are super excited to have you here on the show with us, joining in remotely. And just to give everyone that's listening a quick intro on who Daniel Halberg is, he's a good friend of mine, and he's also a Spanish freelance certified medical interpreter. And he works here in the Portland area as a medical interpreter, and he also is a medical interpreter trainer. He's taught at the OHCI trainings, as well as done workshops and several conferences here throughout Oregon. So extremely talented interpreter. I must say, one of the best interpreters that I've heard do simultaneous. He does an amazing simultaneous workshop. If you ever get a chance to attend one of his workshops, it is literally life-changing. And he's inspired a lot of young interpreters to take their game to the next level. And today we're going to be talking about remote interpretation, something that is drastically changing right now as we speak here due to the coronavirus. And we're really going to be diving into what is remote interpretation looking like now today, and what do we think it's going to be? And for those individuals who are getting into it or thinking about getting into it, what questions should they be asking? What steps can they take? How can you be a better remote interpreter? And for providers, for medical providers that are working with interpreters remote, whether that's over the phone or via video, what are some tools and tips that we can share with them? So without further ado, Daniel, how did you first get started as an interpreter? Take us back a little bit and share us some information.
Sure, definitely. First off, I'd just like to thank you real quick, David, and really appreciate the opportunity to come on this platform and share my experience with your audience, as well as the many opportunities you've given me in the past, both as an interpreter and as a trainer at Linguava. It's been a wonderful, wonderful association. I'm really appreciative of you guys and all the work that you do. Jumping into my experience as an interpreter, I never expected to be an interpreter, to be honest truth. And I got into interpreting the first time in a professional capacity when I was living in southern Chile, probably sometime around 2014. I was working as a tour guide in addition to some other things as well. And I got a connection that asked for me to go to a small agricultural fair that was being run by the New Zealand Agricultural Consulate Office, who was providing products and services and trying to build connections with local institutions in Chile where I was living at the time.
Yeah.
And so I was connected with a local university, and I ended up going around with the university and meeting the different vendors that were trying to provide services, and kind of flipped into simultaneous from the get-go and was providing that kind of a service for that group. And that was my first experience of actually working as an interpreter in any capacity. Along those same lines, while I was living in Chile, I was at an entrepreneurial workshop. I was an entrepreneur at that time. I ran a small artisan bakery out of my house and was a door-to-door salesman for my product. And I was at a workshop that was being hosted by a government office trying to promote entrepreneurial ventures in the area. Right. And there was a gentleman from Australia who got up and was trying to give a presentation to a 100% or 99.9%, besides myself, Chilean audience. And he didn't speak Spanish. And you could see that he was kind of trying to crack his jokes and present his presentation. And people that knew me that were at the workshop kind of turned to me and said, hey, we don't really understand what he's saying. And there was an opportunity there. It was coincidental that the workshop was about how to take advantage of opportunities in moments of need. Right. And this gentleman didn't have an interpreter, and this audience wasn't able to appreciate it. So I kind of got up on stage spontaneously and improvised an interpretation for him on the spot, as we always do. All of us who are interpreters
Right, yeah.
thrown into all sorts of situations like that.
Yeah.
But it's then to jump specifically to medical interpreting and my work here in the Portland area. I moved back to the United States back in 2015. I moved to Portland, Oregon in 2016. Went on a bunch of bad job interviews. Didn't really have an idea of what I was doing. I wasn't looking for interpretation specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked out of one of those job interviews and I was in downtown Portland and I saw an office building that said language services. And I said, hey, I'm bilingual.
It just sucked you right in.
Go see what that's about. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's the story for many of us interpreters. That maybe wasn't something we were planning on doing initially, but then just get those of us who love languages, it just it sucks us right in. So now you've been interpreting here in the Portland area, like I mentioned, interpreting at different agencies and working at different conferences. Daniel, let's talk about the times that we're in right now. We are in unprecedented, uncharted territories here as we speak, and it's all come within the last 3 weeks, right? Really, right? 4 weeks ago,
yeah.
No one could have imagined where we would be right now due to COVID-19, and every industry is pretty much being affected, right? And negatively impacted. Some industries aren't, but almost every industry is being negatively impacted. And the interpretation industry is one of those. On-site interpreting across the country here in the U.S. I'm on several different Facebook groups with medical interpreters. This is an all Spanish group that I'm in, and all interpreters, whether they're remote or on-site, are saying the volume's down, but especially for on-site interpreters. What has been your take? And I know you're also continuing to do some on-site and remote interpreting. What has been the experience for you so far over the last several weeks?
It's a really good question. Obviously, we all find ourselves in this situation together beyond our industry, as you stated. We, as a country, as a people, as a human race everywhere in the world, without borders, without language barriers, we're all kind of going through this experience at the same time. And that way, it's one of those moments where we as a species and a global civilization are all kind of finding ourselves in the same situation. And obviously, jumping back down and kind of microscopically looking at our industry and myself as an individual, my experience of what's happened over the last couple of weeks was that, as you're aware, David, but I'm sure your audience isn't, I was actually out of the country for about 10 weeks prior to this, and I came back on March 1st after having taken a 10-week sabbatical from a very busy year last year. And I got a couple of real strong work weeks in of on-site interpreting. As you said, I typically do over 40 hours a week. I work with over 5 agencies in order to do those on-site appointments.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, Monday, March 16th, I'm doing a normal day of appointments. We kind of are all paying attention to the news and seeing what's going on. And I get 20 cancellations for the rest of the month because I'm somebody who builds my appointments over weeks. And that's how I keep myself busy.
Yeah.
Tuesday comes along, the 17th of March, and all of a sudden I get 20 plus more cancellations for the rest of the month. They're just dropping all over the place. And I'm already looking at the fact that I'm getting more stressed out, not only by the situation in the world, but also knowing that I'm getting these constant cancellations. Am I going to be going into medical facilities, exposing myself to the risk of contamination for one appointment? Am I actually providing a service? What's going to happen? And at that point on Tuesday, the 17th, I called back my agencies and I gave back all of my appointments for the foreseeable future. And Wednesday, the 18th, I became, for the first time, an over-the-phone interpreter. And I did not expect to ever go into remote interpreting. I never expected to do phone interpreting. One of the things that I enjoy about the profession of interpreting is working with people face to face, seeing the different aspects of the industry, getting to be exposed to, not exposed to diseases or viruses, obviously, but also being able to be exposed to the different aspects of the medical field. I find it endlessly fascinating. And so I never intended to be sitting at home isolated and doing over the phone interpreting, but it was the situation come Wednesday. And I definitely felt a little bit more hunger and a little bit more pressure given the fact that I had so recently gotten back from such a long duration. So the idea of sitting around and doing nothing wasn't
I can
an
only
option,
imagine.
or I didn't want to make it an option. I wanted to look for possibilities there. And obviously, it's not as easy as just saying you jump into doing phone interpreting. Well, if you don't have the existing infrastructure, then how do you do it? Well, the first place I started was, as I said, I worked with 5 agencies. So I contacted my existing agencies to find what sort of telephonic or remote interpreting options they were providing and how I could get involved with them. And that was step number 1. And then at the same time, investigating new ones. The new reality, I was staring at unemployment. I applied for unemployment because I immediately saw a drop off of work, of over 90% of my appointments. And just started making myself available for telephonic.
With that initial shift, what was maybe 1 or 2 things that jumped out at you that maybe surprised you as becoming a telephonic interpreter that you weren't expecting? Was it a seamless transition for you, or was there some things that immediately caught your attention that were unique you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I think that's another really thoughtful question. I think that my experience is that things that make you a good on-site interpreter also apply in the telephonic world and the remote interpreting world. I have found over the years that I've been working as an interpreter here in this area, it's important if you are a freelance interpreter and you are working for yourself at the end of the day to diversify and have a wide net of agencies so that you're not reliant on one source of work. And that's as important now in the telephonic world as it is when you are doing on-site interpretation. Some people feel more comfortable working with just one. I advocate for, if you can keep yourself organized and manage it, casting a wide net. But alongside with casting a wide net is being reliable and being respectful in how you engage with the agencies. I think one thing that is important to keep in mind that I think that most interpreters that last beyond 1 year probably realize for themselves, but I think a lot of us experience, and probably when we get together and kind of fetch in the Yiddish sense of the word, when we complain to each other about some of the things that we deal with as freelance interpreters, is that at the end of the day, the agencies are actually our customers. They're the ones that we are contracting to our services. And so being able to have that good sense of customer service with the people who work at the agencies, be respectful, be kind, ask them how they're doing, check in with them. We're all going through a hard time. And it's a really great opportunity to share in that humanity with people that we work alongside with. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of doing it and letting them know you're available. Sitting around and expecting for work to find you has never been my experience, whether it was on-site interpreting or remote interpreting. So sometimes that means calling in regularly over the course of a day and letting people know, talking to multiple people at those places and saying, hey, I'm available. I can take phone calls. Setting aside a set time that you are going to make yourself available and being consistent about that so that can be relied upon. It's again, that same notion of being reliable and respectful with other people's time so that they can do the same for you and make sure that you're getting the work that you can provide because you have those skills.
So for someone who's maybe been an on-site interpreter and they want to then now go remote and try video relay or try telephonic, what advice would you give them as far as what are some ways that they can practice besides just practicing as an on-site interpreter, which is really difficult right now with the low volume across the board? But what are other ways in which one could practice telephonic interpretation or video that you can think of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say for people who have done on-site and are looking to go to OPI or over the phone interpreting, remote interpreting, whether it be video remote interpreting, I think that there are certain skill sets that are more important to have in the over the phone or the remote interpreting context than they are necessarily in the face-to-face one. And I think that we all should have strong consecutive interpreting skills. But as you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, or at least the introduction into me, I work a lot in simultaneous, and I'm also used to transitioning into simultaneous in some consecutive situations when all the parties accept it, because it allows for a kind of natural conversational flow that is a little bit more choppy when you're doing consecutive.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're on the phone and you're having phone interpreting, it's really important to have those strong consecutive interpreting skills. So working to build your memory, working to retain that information. And it's not realistic to expect you yourself to be able to hold all of the information you're going to get in remote interpreting situations in your head. So alongside building those strong consecutive interpreting skills that we talked about at the beginning, there's also a real importance for note-taking skills, which is something I have always put off doing as an on-site interpreter. I prefer to let my speed keep me in the flow of the conversation and not have to kind of jot down those notes. But when you're talking on the phone, it's really important, whether it be numbers, you could be doing blood sugar checks for a patient who's getting a diabetic exam, or you could be doing blood pressure checks. And numbers, as every interpreter knows, and hopefully some providers can be aware of this as well, don't have context to them. So when you're talking in a sentence, every word in the sentence informs the meaning of every other word, and they're kind of interconnected in a way that allows for us as interpreters, or us as people who understand language, to be able to pull meaning as a combined effort of all of those different parts of a statement. Whereas a phone number is 100% arbitrary. The numbers are interchangeable. There's nothing that makes one number have any kind of special meaning in relationship to the other numbers, other than maybe the area code, which is a unit of meaning in the same way that we talk about units of meaning when we talk about language. And so for the interpreter, having those strong note-taking skills, I have a pen, I have an agenda book. In fact, I've gotten so used to it that even while we're talking on the phone right now, I'm taking notes. I'm jotting down thoughts while we're talking. So it's important to kind of build that skill set so that if you're doing telephonic calls, if you're doing remote interpreting, you have the ability to write down phone numbers. You have the ability to write down maybe medication names. That can be especially challenging. It's always challenging when you're working with different types of pronunciation.
Correct.
But having that available to you. Alongside that, working on your flow control when you're on the telephone, it's super important, more so even than face-to-face, I would argue, to have good control of the flow of the conversation. And we all have experiences as interpreters, maybe as providers as well, of having a conversation lose that flow and suddenly it gets lost, or meaning gets dissolved, or it doesn't have a natural conversational feel to it. So working on good flow control is very important for the interpreter to develop as they transition from on-site to over the phone or remote. I would also argue that patience is important, especially over the phone. And this is where those strong consecutive skills and note-taking skills kind of come into play. But when you're listening to someone speak in a phone context, it's even more so important, because we don't just, not only us as the interpreters, we don't have access to the context clues of body language. Well, the other people that potentially are on the phone doing a telehealth appointment also don't have that available to them. And so it's really important to have the patience to allow for the provider, the patient, to finish their thought without jumping in and breaking them off, in order to allow them to express themselves. And that really requires us to be able to retain in our memory that information, whether through notes or through memory itself. And that goes a long way. And kind of tying into that, and I think we're going to be talking about this as well in a second, but having a concise strategy already planned for clarification. And that doesn't have to be anything super fancy. But if you do have to ask either the patient or the provider what they were going to say, being ready and knowing what you're going to say to be able to ask for that clarification.
Yeah, and that can be, from talking to interpreters, I know that can be an additional challenge with telephonic, because you can't see the individual. I know with on-site, when I would interpret, I would usually raise my hand and lean in a little bit, so immediately the provider and patient can see that I'm going to share something, right? And so obviously with telephonic, you don't have that. With video, you do a little bit, but with telephonic, you don't have that that physical piece of like, oh, hold on a minute, I need to jump in. So you really have to literally kind of cut someone off in that regard. So maybe walk us through just a quick example of you needing to ask for a clarification or a repetition or something like that when the provider is or patient is speaking on a telephonic call.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I would say that if you have to ask for a clarification on a telehealth call and you are working in this remote capacity, first thing, as you would do when you are working on an on-site capacity, you identify yourself as the interpreter in the third person, and you say the interpreter would like clarification, or in the target language, if it's referred to a non-English speaking individual, then you would go into the same statement, but you would do it in the language proper to the person that you need clarification for. And then what I always do, especially in the telephonic capacity, because it might not be clear, is I then let the other party know in the opposite language that I sought clarification, and I just give a brief review of what the point of clarification was. I think it's important with that in mind. If you are taking notes, it helps and avoids the need for as much clarification. It changes your mindset. Being in an environment that doesn't lead to distractions is super important as well. And then there's other things that you can do, such as being quick to the bat if you are having connection issues. I can't tell you, I've done 3 calls this morning before we started having this conversation.
Yeah.
And I had to say, excuse me, would you mind speaking a little bit closer to the microphone of your phone so that I can hear you clearly?
Yeah.
Rather than allow for the conversation to get going without being able to have a proper balance of conversation. It's important to establish that at the outset. And those expectations kind of go hand in hand with also introducing yourself potentially as an interpreter, establishing what your role is, how you are going to facilitate the call. And sometimes that can feel redundant,
right?
Especially when you're doing 15 phone calls in an hour as opposed to doing eight appointments over the course of a day. Yeah. But it is important to establish that you are the interpreter. You will be using the first person and all the things that we are told and expect to do as interpreters in order to facilitate the conversation. We can avoid problems by setting those expectations from the get-go.
Yeah, no, that's great feedback there, Daniel. And I know we're getting close on time. I want to be respectful of your time as well. One quick thing that I know providers would want to hear would be if you could give them a tip when working with a remote interpreter, whether that might be telephonic or video. What would you share with them that they should be aware of or that they should know going into the appointment?
Sure. I think I've got maybe 5 quick points that I can point out to a provider that might be beneficial to them to be able to use their interpretive services to maximum advantage.
Yeah.
Number 1, this is my biggest pet peeve, avoid tangents. And what I mean is, if you're going to be making a statement, have the statement all be applicable to the idea you're trying to say. Don't jump off onto a separate lane. Don't switch topics with no pause. And as an interpreter, maybe we are able to handle tangents here and there, but as a method of communicating, it's challenging even inside the same language, and it certainly loses something when you are interpreting it. So avoid tangents is an important one, and probably the most important, if I could ask providers out there to do so. Another important thing to do is to enunciate. So make sure that you're speaking with a full open mouth. Not all of us are necessarily presenters or used to talking in front of people, but maybe be a little bit more conscious of how you're saying what you're saying as you say it. Kind of going along with tangents is keep segments concise and relevant. That doesn't mean they have to be short. Interpreters can handle a lot of information, but keep them concise. Make sure that it's relevant to what you're saying as you're saying it. Spell out medical names. It's often very challenging without having the medical name in front of you as a provider to be able to properly say a medical name. These names are crazy. And if you want to make sure, especially if there's any kind of confusion about what type of medicine the patient might be taking, make sure to spell them out and take your time with it. And then lastly is just to be patient. to have
Yeah.
patience with regards to the whole situation. Don't try to speed up the conversation because you have other things to do. Recognize that you are using an interpreter and you are speaking with a limited English proficiency patient, and give that the
Yeah.
time that it deserves. Be patient.
Love that. Those are great 5 tips for providers. And I think they can even apply to us interpreters as well. So that's super helpful. Daniel, so this has been a very, very riveting and educational and helpful conversation for I'm sure many of us here. Where can people find you if they want to have further questions for you directly, or they want to be able to um, reach out to you or invite you to an upcoming workshop or training? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah. Well, thank you again, David, for having me on here. This is a really wonderful opportunity to have conversations about our industry in this format, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you.
Yeah.
You can reach out to me at Daniel, Daniel, OR, like the state of Oregon, OR, interpreter, INTERPRETER @gmail.com. I also have a website or a Facebook page that I use when I'm teaching classes. It doesn't actually have much information on there, and that's Oregon Interpreter Class. You can search for that on Facebook. That's more so a resource that I use to provide class information when I do workshops. But you can definitely contact me either on that Facebook page, or you can contact me at that email address. And I probably won't be doing conferences for the near future.
Right. I know.
I would definitely be willing to consult or talk with anybody.
Yeah. Hopefully here at some point soon, later down the road. But we'll hopefully that comes sooner than later. So my last question for you, Daniel, before we cut off here is, as an interpreter and working in the medical space, what is the impact that you would like to have on the world? And I know you weren't expecting that question. So
that's a different question.
However you want to interpret that question.
Sure. I think that as an interpreter, the impact that I'd like to have on the world is, and this is actually something I was having a conversation with my partner just this past week, and I think I've talked about it with my family a little bit as I've been working in telephonic this past couple of weeks. There's this unique opportunity as an interpreter where, through the tone of your voice, the positivity that you're able to kind of imbue through a sense of confidence and calm, that you can make interactions between people that might have gone off the rails, that might have gotten frustrating, that might have turned into something less positive and constructive for positive health outcomes, or just for having a good day. Yeah. There's an opportunity as an interpreter to interject yourself in those spaces. And kind of like a ninja, you're a little bit invisible. You're kind of in the background.
Yeah.
The invisible profession.
Yeah.
You're able to affect change in doing your job well and confidently, and kind of disappearing into the background. I think with interpreting specifically, it's the impact I would like to have is for equal access for all people. And a greater degree of participation from all people, because obviously it's not always just medical, but in conference settings and other places, for everyone to be able to communicate and share their experiences or reach the assistance that they need. That would be the impact, to be a part of that process, to facilitate other people being able to reach their potential or change their day by doing it confidently, instead of having it being frustrating or negative. That would be the impact.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's a big impact you tucked in there. So no, we love that. And Daniel, I have no doubt that you are one for sure that is going to be leaving a legacy behind with the work that you're doing, and just have a real big heart for the community. And we're grateful to have you on board and have you a part of our community. So thank you all for tuning in to the show here with Daniel. We'd love to hear your feedback as well. Any feedback or questions that you have about our conversation, things that you agreed with, disagreed with, go ahead and just share those in the comments. And if you think that there's someone that might also enjoy this conversation, please go ahead and share the podcast or the video with others, and go ahead and hit like and subscribe as well, so you can get more conversations and videos just like this one. So thank you everyone for listening in. And Daniel, it was a pleasure to have you on this morning, and I hope you have a wonderful day.